Hey folks, so in this video, we're going to take a look at a new ethical theory called social contract theory. So suppose for a moment the following. Maybe we live in a world where there is no kind of overall governance or overall rules that we adhere to. What would it look like? And maybe specifically, let's think about maybe the example of property. Well, if you live in a world where there's no kind of overall rules of how people are supposed to act, right, or how people are supposed to, or how people are supposed to conduct themselves, well, maybe you have a situation where all of a sudden, people never do things like create something or invest in something, right? Because it's like, well, if I have something, right, maybe somebody else is free to take it away from me. And so the world becomes a little bit strange, right? People don't create things, right? Uh, so this is kind of a thought that was had by Thomas Hobbes here, which is mentioned, is mentioned on the slide here. So he basically suggests is that, okay, hey, in this kind of natural state of the world, right, where there is kind of no rules by which people are supposed to live, our lives would be, and I'll quote here from the slide, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So you end up having basically no stability. There is kind of this thought here, right, is that if we were to cooperate with people, right, if we were to say, okay, my stuff belongs to me, your stuff belongs to you, maybe the world could look a little bit better. And so from this, we get kind of the basic idea of social contract theory. So the idea of social contract theory kind of has two parts of it. First of all, right, is there is some sort of set of moral rules, right, which everybody follows for the sake of being able to cooperate effectively. And hopefully, right, there's this idea, right, is that you have more to gain, right, by cooperating with other people than you have by kind of living in solitude, right, and just kind of being off by yourself. So that's the first thought here. The second thought, right, is that if we have these kind of moral rules, right, which everybody should be following in order to, cooperate effectively, well, then there should be some sort of a government, right, that can enforce these rules, right? They can make sure that people actually behave according to, what is said here, and not kind of just, try to make some sort of exception for themselves, or they, benefit more than somebody else. So those are the two aspects to social contract theory, right? One, that we have these overall moral rules that enable people to cooperate with one another, and second, that we have some sort of a government in place, right, that can enforce these rules. So there at the bottom, right, we have another idea there by, and I know I'm gonna mispronounce this, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So the point there he kind of uses or makes, right, to extend this basic social contract theory proposed by Thomas Hobbes, right, is first of all, right, in an ideal society, right, no one above rules. Instead, there's some kind of common framework or some kind of common rule set whereby everybody is expected to behave in the same way. Now, sometimes, right, there's maybe this issue of, oh, if we're going to define a set of rules which everyone must follow, right, in society, there is kind of maybe a temptation somehow that some people may want to define rules, right, that benefit themselves, in a certain way. Well, okay, that's an issue, right? But ideally, right, we want to basically have, a society where all rules are imposed on everybody equally. And so there's kind of this idea that, if you were to ask somebody, what are these set of moral rules, that everybody should follow, right, to enable cooperation, well, they should basically, you should be obligated, right, to come up with your set of rules, right, if you don't really know what is your place in society, right? So you don't know, your class, your economic background, you don't know, what, where you live, right? If you were, to basically to be blind, right, to the type of person you are, right, you should be able to come up with some set of rules, right? And that, right, if you're unbiased, right, well, that set of rules, right, you come up with basically should be unbiased, right? Because somebody who's come up with a set of rules, right, kind of doesn't know, how am I going to fit into this, right? And so you're obligated to come up with kind of, or you're motivated, I should say, to come up with a set of rules, right, that applies to everybody equally fairly, because you yourself, right, may be, any type of person. Okay, but it's something we have to be careful of, because otherwise, kind of in I want to say the natural course of things, maybe the instinct is to, oh yeah, I'm going to somehow, suggest things in such a way, right, that it's maybe a little bit more beneficial for me than somebody else. So this is a definition, and I'll kind of read this. So this brings together some of the ideas in the previous slide. So this is from James Rachel's. Morality consists in the set of rules governing how people are to treat one another that rational people will agree to for their mutual benefit on the condition that others follow those rules as well, right? So this is a statement based off of our previous ideas, right? Basically say, so cooperation, right, is better than being off by yourself, right? And then, right, in order for that to, for people to kind of come together, we should have some sort of set of rules, right, that is equally applied to everybody, right? We don't want to have kind of exceptions, right, where somebody's benefit is where someone is, has somehow, more advantages than somebody else, because all of a sudden those rules, right, well, maybe I don't want to follow them, right, because I know that somebody else following those same rules, right, gets the benefit that I don't, and that's unfair, right? So we have to have this sense of equality. So from this definition, right, we have this idea of these moral rules that should exist. Well, basically, these moral rules, right, people may have different types of rights, and so there are a few types here. So let's go through these really quick. So first of all, there's the idea of a negative right. Right. So a negative right is going to be something like you have the right to, well, You have something like a right to free speech, right? So basically, what we're saying is a negative right is that people agree not to do something to you, right? So I'm not going to interrupt you, right? I'm not going to prevent you from having your say, right? That's a negative right. Second thing we have, right, is a positive right. So maybe we have something like a right to let's say we have a right to education, right? Maybe that's an appropriate example for us, right? In that case, right, maybe people need to do things for you, right? They need to make sure that, oh, the system is in place, right? There's some sort of, there's taxes that pay for your schooling, whatever. That's something, right, that requires work by somebody else, right? So that's the idea of a positive right. The third thing we have there, right, is an absolute right. So an absolute right is something that we should always have, right? So maybe people always have, a right to be alive or something like that, right? That's something that's kind of always in place, right? Versus we have also the idea of a limited right. So a limited right, maybe we jump back to the idea of education for a positive right. A limited right, maybe something that's like, well, everybody has a right to education, but I mean, there are kind of limits, right? We can't, we can expect that in society, right? Thinking of modern society, right? You're not gonna, and everybody isn't going to be able. We're not able to give everybody, a free 4-year degree, right? It's not really realistic, right? So yeah, everybody maybe has a right to an education, but there's a certain extent to which that'll actually be available, right? Just because there are, kind of real world constraints. So these are kind of the different types of rights we're talking about, right? So positive, negative, absolute versus limited. Now between these, right, there are kind of a little bit of a correlation, right? So typically, right, positive rights, right, where people are, have to, do something to you, right? The rights you have, right, obligate somebody else to take some action, right? Those tend to be more limited, right? So they're obviously, right, in a system, right, kind of need to respect somebody else, right? We don't want to overly burden them, right? Everybody should kind of have an equal burden. And so in that case, right, of a positive right, typically it's going to be more limit, right? You get the first, you have maybe your primary education is free, but later education, right, is not free, or something like that. Then, right, we have this kind of, again, a linkage between negative and absolute, right? So if I have sort of a negative right to free speech, right, something that doesn't really, cost somebody else or burden somebody else, well, then that really should be, an absolute a right, that everybody for sure always has at any given time. So now that we've seen kind of the original or the basic view of social contract theory, let's take a look at a more, well, I'll say a more modern idea. Maybe that's not really fair. Social contract theory, right, has been around for many years. Right? I think it was first kind of proposed maybe in the 1600s. Let's take a look at basically kind of a new idea, and this is more maybe about how we go about picking our rules, right? Our moral rules, right? That hopefully, right, enables everybody to cooperate, right, and have a society that's better, right, than living off by yourself. So these ideas, right, come from John Rawls, right? So these are his principles of justice, right? So this is hopefully an idea of how we structure our rules. So his first thought is the following: so every person, right, may claim a fully adequate number of basic rights and liberties. So basically, the idea is this, right? Everybody has some sort of basic rights, right? And those rights, right? The way we pick those rights by saying that those should be things, right, that's reasonable to give to everybody, right? Rather than it being specific or privileged to a specific person, right, based on what is their background or whatever, right? We want to instead say that everybody, in our very definition, right, the rights that we give to people are rights that we should be able to give to everyone. Okay, so that's kind of first thought there. The second thought, okay, so any social and economic inequalities must, and there's some bullet points down there. Basically, the idea is this: if you're going to introduce some inequality, right, and so the first claim here, right, the first bullet point, right, saying treat everybody the same, right. You should only have something, right, if you can do that. Well, the second rule here is saying, or the second idea here is saying is, well, maybe you do have to introduce inequality. Well, when you do introduce inequality, right, among people, right, there's some rule, right, that somehow privileges somebody, right, over somebody else. You want to have that rule basically. Well, the rule should impact people in a way that it basically is an advantage. Okay? I'll quote here because I know I'm going to mess with the words. It's of greatest benefit to the least advantage members of society. So we'll actually talk about that example. We'll give an example of that in a second. But basically, the idea is, right, if you're going to disadvantage somebody, well, you should, the person who you advantage through disadvantaging the original person maybe is someone who's not doing so well, something like that, right? Somebody who's already not as privileged, right? That maybe is a little bit hand wavy there. I'll show you guys an example in a second. So let's just take a look at these diagrams really fast. So these are the diagrams provided by the book. So the first one is just the thought of that first bullet point, saying, okay, if we're going to have our rules, right, under Rawls, principles of justice, right. The thought is that everybody should have equal rights, right. So our system is just, right, if we have everybody kind of on equal footing, right. Everybody has kind of the same stuff available to them, right. That's kind of a just scenario. Versus if we have things that privilege somebody else, that's no longer just. right? So we want the kind of situation on the left where any rules we give to people, right, are things that can be fairly applied to everybody. Now, to try and illustrate in a better way the second point that was made, right, this is this idea of introducing inequalities. The name for this, right, is officially the difference principle. Okay, so let's take a look at this diagram here. So on the bottom we have our axis, right, personal income, right? So from left to right, people that make less to people that make more. On the horizontal we have the amount of interest tax paid. And then we have two plans, A and B. So A is basically a flat tax, right? So basically it's some fixed ratio at a fixed percentage, right, of whatever it is that you make, right? And so as you go from left to right, that A is always increasing, right? And it starts kind of at this non-zero number. Okay, that's maybe one approach to taxation. Second approach is Plan B, right, which is maybe a progressive tax scheme. Well, so here, right, basically you can notice if you look at the first point, low income, right? Basically in Plan B, you're not really paying taxes, and then only as you go, further, right, do you start to pay taxes, and eventually, right, on the people that have, very high income, they're really paying proportionately more taxes than people that have less, right? And so in Plan A, right, Plan A, everybody gets treated equally, right? So maybe that's fine by kind of Raoul's first idea, which just says, everybody, gets kind of the same, has the same rights, right? So here, right, everybody has to pay the same amount of taxes. But Plan B, right, is actually introduces an inequality. But here again, it's fine by Raoul's ideas because you're basically the people who you're disadvantaged. So here, right, the people you're disadvantaging are the people with the higher income. But when you disadvantage them, right, basically things, in a sense, are balancing out somehow because people that have lower incomes, right, don't pay as much taxes, right? So the balancing, I suppose, happens there, right, in terms of the overall taxes that are paid. And according to Raoul's, well, hey, we're disadvantaging someone, but the person, and we're disadvantaging the people that make money. But when we're disadvantaging them, the people who benefit from that are the people, right, that are in a worse position, right? The people that have less income. So in that sense, right, the inequality is still going to be okay by Raoul's principles of justice. Now let's take a look at an example. So this is the DVD rental scenario. So in here, right, basically we have this idea. We have this guy, right, who owns, a DVD rental shop. So his name is Bill. And, over the course of, just doing business, right, he does things like he records, what DVDs do people rent, how long do they rent them for, has their payment information, their address, their names, has all this information. And so he figures, oh, hey, you know what I'm going to do is because I know customers or I know a little bit about their shopping habits, maybe I can, sell this information to some, marketing firms, some other business, right? And well, probably what's going to happen is you're going to end up, becoming, some sort of a mailing list, and they're going to get spammed with stuff. But maybe he can do that, right? So that's the sample scenario. Right? He collects all this information and he sells it to a third party, and they go do something else with it. So this is one thing, right, that maybe happens in practice a little more often than it should. So let's think about how maybe we would look at this, right, in kind of the lens of the social contract theory. So here, right, we basically need to think about the rights of the agents involved, right? So all the kind of the rational actors, right? So we have Bill, the customers, the mail order companies. So the question is, right, what rights do people have, right? Does the customer, for example, have a right to privacy, right? That's kind of a yay or nay, right? We haven't really defined specific rights under social contract theory, right? We've just had this idea of this is we want people want to have these basic rights, or they're following, right, these basic moral laws, right, in order to collaborate with one another more effectively, and from that, right, we define specific rights, but we haven't really stated what rights there are, right? So first thought here is, what rights do people have, right? What rights do customers have? Do they have a right to privacy? And the thought is, okay, every time, right, there's a transaction, right, a customer buys something from Bill, right, there's some sort of exchange of information. Who has rights to that information, right? Is it equal or is it unequal, right? So there's also that sense of equality from the principles of justice. Well, in this case, right, basically we say, okay, if they have equal rights to information, right? Both Bill and the customer have equal rights to the information that's exchanged. Well, then maybe it's okay, right? Under social contract theory, right? Under the sense of equality, then yeah, Bill can do whatever he wants basically with the contact information he's gotten for the customer, because the customer can do the same thing, right? They can also take the contact information from Bill, right? Maybe sell Bill's home address, right, or company address, right, to a company to send them ads in the mail. Right, maybe that's okay. But then if we're under the other situation, right, where maybe there is an inequality, right, instead the customer does have their kind of right to privacy over Bill, well then yes, there would be kind of an issue here, right? And then in that case, right, social contract theory basically says, that the Bill's not following, those kind of rules that are set in place. Therefore, right, he's not acting, morally in that case. So Again, right, the issue here, well, kind of the overall concern here, right, is that we basically need to identify, what are the rights of the different actors in our system, right, and kind of see, what is the expectation, right, and is that expectation that was set implicitly, right? So often, right, somehow, right here, there's a sense of implicit rules, right? So we're saying, okay, customers something like a right to privacy, right? That may not necessarily be something that was explicitly laid out, right? So when customers started shopping at Bill's place, Bill probably did not have this agreement that says, okay, I'm going to do X, Y, Z with the information. Probably you didn't have that. It was just kind of given, right, implicitly that that information would be kept private, right? And so we need to kind of identify those rules, right? What is the expectations that were set? What are the rights that were granted, right? And it could also be said explicitly, right? So Bill maybe could have had an agreement. Okay, you want to shop here, right? You want to rent DVDs from me. You have to read through this, right? It says, oh, I may sell your information to a third party, right? That may be an explicit setting of rules. So anyways, key thing is, right, to understand what rules are in play, and then we can judge, right, are the actors in the scenario, are they kind of following those rules or not, right? And hopefully our choice of our rules, right, kind of meets some of the ideas that were suggested by, the principles of social justice, in that we know that they are kind of real rules that are just. So let's now take a look at kind of the case for social contract theory, right, where we'd maybe choose that as our ideal ethical theory. Well, it's not even appropriate to say that, but the case for it, right? Why is it worth talking about? All right, so first thing here, right, is that it's framed kind of in the language of rights. So basically we're saying, right, this is maybe something of a Western idea. Social contract theory, right, is about kind of the rights of individuals, right? So as an individual, right, you have a right to freedom of speech, right? You have a right to life, you have a right to, whatever it may be, right? But those are all individual rights, right? So that's kind of something maybe that is familiar to us at least, or me at least. All right. Second bullet point explains why people act in self-interest in the absence of a common agreement. So here's just a thought and it's also related here, right, the tragedy of the commons. Well, there's kind of this observation here, right, that basically, right, if people can do whatever they want, right, they're going to basically act in a way, right, that is most advantageous to them, right? I mean, why wouldn't you? It feels a little bad to say that, but that's ultimately what it boils down to, right? Is that people, right, realistically, right, people kind of are going to naturally act in their own interest. So just to touch real briefly on that little phrase here, the tragedy of the commons, the idea is this, right, is maybe you have some situation, right, where if a person were to act a certain way, it would advantage them while disadvantaging somebody else. Okay, so you imagine that. And so maybe, right, that person chooses to, not just for whatever reason, right, chooses, not to act in a way, right, that disadvantages other people. Well, then you still have the issue of, oh, somebody, another party, right, can step in and perform that same action, right, that disadvantages the group, right? So you kind of have this dilemma here, right, where it's like, well, people may act in such a way, right, that they disadvantage a ton of other people, right, and you kind of, can't really control that. Social contract theory hopefully should address that, right? Because it's saying, okay, right, we want to basically have a situation, right, where everybody is on equal footing, right, where you don't disadvantage other people. So maybe that's kind of an intuitive thing that we think is good or just. Last remark here, right, is that social contract theory provides a way, right, to explain, some things we see, right, where basically people maybe have maybe their rights are restricted, right, or maybe they exercise rights that are in violation of maybe law, typical. I would say typical. I would say laws, right? Not a moral law, but just a law. Period. So the idea here, right, is basically say, okay, hey, some people, right, we may somehow deprive them of rights. Right, people in jail, right, all of a sudden you're not exactly free anymore. Right? You can't do whatever you want. Well, that's okay because okay, when we do that, right, the people who are and then the last slide here, right, is it provides a clear analysis of certain citizen/government problems, right? So maybe some people, right, end up having maybe the government maybe restricts their rights, right? So you think of maybe people in jail or something like that. Well, then the thought is here, right? Social contract theory talks about inequality and saying, okay, you can introduce inequalities, right? So maybe people do have different rights here, but the hope is, right, that basically even if you're disadvantaging somebody, right, hopefully there's somebody else, right, that's maybe in a worse scenario, right, that is kind of advantaged in place of that. That's odd thing to say. All right, so let's talk also about basically the counter case against social contract theory. So the big one there, right, the first bullet point is no one signed a social contract, right? So the idea was we said, oh, hey, people should follow these rules because it's better to live as a group than as an individual. And then there's in order to enforce that, right, because people tend to do their own things and maybe somehow benefit themselves. We need some sort of a government or some sort of enforcement of laws. Well, the issue with all of that stuff, right, is basically say, oh, hey, I didn't agree to any of that, right? So there's no kind of paper that lists out what are these rules we're agreeing to, right? And we did not formally agree to them, and that's just a little bit awkward, right? It's a little bit awkward to say that this is the way things work when really nobody has agreed to this contract. So very awkward. Second thing there, right, is there maybe is multiple yeah, multiple multiple characterizations of a scenario. So thinking back to the DVD store, right, we had kind of a discussion of, oh, what kind of rights are involved, right? Is there, a right to privacy, right? Do people have, an equal, right to the information in those transactions? We may kind of have different, there may be kind of different rights at play, right, in a given scenario. And that's kind of not such a good thing because all of a sudden, depending on what rights we kind of, say are valid under our social contract theory, we may end up with kind of a different value, a different different analysis at the end of the day, right? Because we're looking at those rules and trying to figure out, is this a scenario in which people adhere to those rules or not? There's also an issue, right, of conflicting rule rights, right? So you can imagine, right, as you have a situation, right, where we had these different types of rights, and there's some absolute rights. You may have a situation, right, where you have maybe absolute rights that kind of conflict, right? Somebody has an absolute right to life. Somebody else has an absolute right. Maybe somebody else has an absolute right to life as well, right? All of a sudden, it's like, well, only one person can live, right? Maybe think of those little philosophical problems, right? Um, there may be some sort of conflict, right? Because we rely on absolute rules. It's like, what do we do in that case, right? Our system really doesn't handle that. And so, last thought there is, how do we deal basically with people who maybe don't understand the contract, right? So we're saying, right, there's some sort of implicit social contract, right? How people should behave, right? Everybody should at least be able to understand it. But maybe for imagine maybe someone under the influence of drugs or something like that. Maybe they're not able to understand that, right? Understand the rules that are in play, right? The expectations, right? How does that fit into the system, right? Here we're kind of assuming that everybody has a perfect understanding of the rules, and so you can hold them responsible, right, if they violate a specific rule. We don't really have a case, right, where, well, I can't really hold somebody accountable for something. That's not really covered by this theory. So overall, right, this is kind of an interesting theory. Again, right, we're talking about this because this is something, right, that, despite some of the issues here, right, it's still kind of a workable theory, right? We're still able to kind of look at a scenario, right, and hopefully, right, present a reason for, oh, this is kind of a just thing to happen or a not just thing to happen, based on, does it follow from kind of our basic tenets of, this is how social contract theory says we should act.